So this Sunday we start our new series, and the new series is entitled Real Sex Matters. And this is a subject that I've talked about, I think, every year I've been at the church, and this is year 10. But this year is going to be very different than how I've approached it in the past. And it's more comprehensive, but I think in the end, I hope it's going to be more helpful, more valuable to our kids, especially as they go forward. So let me explain kind of how I got to the point where I am as we approach this series. The thing I found is that kids today know more about sex than I did when I was their age. There's a lot of reasons for this, and it's not all bad, but a large part because of the internet. Kids, for example, can use a tool like Urban Dictionary to look up words that they hear. I couldn't do that. If I heard a word at school that I didn't know, I either had to guess what it meant or I had to go ask somebody. And now they don't have to do that. They can just flat out look it up on the internet. We hate to talk about it, but it's very much a reality for both guys and girls. Pornography. Pornography is a very different world than it was when I was in high school. In the world of modems and still photos, is nothing now compared to the easy access to pornographic video that you have from your phone, from a lot of internet connections. Just it's so much more readily accessible than it was before. Media, other forms that aren't even pornography, music, television shows, movies, they all send messages about sex. And my theory going into this is that those messages are fake. They're fake. They're not real. They don't explain the ramifications that come with it. They don't explain the responsibilities. And they certainly don't worry about the ethics of what is happening or what isn't happening. So the idea is that I want to talk about sex, but I want to talk about it in a way that's real. Real in a couple ways. One, that is honest. The biggest mistake I think we can make is pretending our kids don't know or that they're not old enough to hear about this stuff. They are. Anyone in middle school or in high school who's been through health class, they know the plumbing, they know the vocabulary, they know how it works, they know where babies come from. But the problem is that sex ed and biology classes don't talk about ethics. They don't talk about the personal relationship side. They don't talk about what's right and what's wrong, what's faithful and what's not. They don't talk about the ideas of love and relationships. They just don't. It's about plumbing, right? It's plumbing lessons. It's how not to get a disease and how not to get pregnant. It doesn't talk about what's right and wrong. So we need to talk about sex. We need to talk about it in ways that are open, honest, and yes, awkward. And that gets me to my second point. Why? Why is it so important that the church talk about sex? Well, two reasons. Number one, the Bible talks a lot about it, believe it or not. A lot of the Old Testament talks about rules regarding sex and what's allowable and what isn't. And God cares deeply about sex. God cares deeply about the relationships we find ourselves in. Why? Because they matter. They matter a great deal. They can be life-giving and they can be destructive. So sex matters, and sex matters a lot to God. God created sex. God put this whole thing together. So that's the first reason. The second reason is that kids need multiple sources that are good talking to them about sex. So even if you say to me, Brian, we do a great job in our house talking about sex with our kids. You don't need to do this at church. I would say, you know what? I'm glad you do, but yes, we still need to talk about this at church. It's very important that they hear from other adults that this is stuff that matters to us, that we care deeply about this. We want them to make wise choices in this area. So what you may be saying is, well, Brian, that sounds really good, but I got a middle school kid, 6th grade, Brian. She won't be having sex anytime soon. You're right. So that's why I want to talk a little bit about the approach I'm going to take in this series, because I'm going to tell you two stories that have changed how I think about this. The first was a story from a girl in our youth group who talked about going to a movie last year with some friends. They went to the movie, it was all girls, and they were sitting in the movie theater, and a boy next to her who she did not know, who she had never met, put his hand on her knee repeatedly. Okay, repeatedly. Now, he was not older, he was about her age, but repeatedly did it. And she would tell him no, but he wouldn't stop. Okay? Now, obviously, at some point, this boy learned that that type of behavior is okay, that it's appropriate, all right? And what I want to teach, both to our youngest kids, is that that's not okay. That's not okay. It's not okay to start touching someone without their permission, all right? It's not okay. But why isn't it okay? It's not okay because the relationship isn't right, all right? And that's what I'm really going to drive home in these next few weeks, along with Steph, is the idea that the physical contact, the physical signs of affection are appropriate or inappropriate based on the relationship that surrounds the two people. So let me explain a very basic thing, right? A handshake is a very appropriate way to greet someone, okay? A hug is a very appropriate way to express affection if the relationship is right, right? So a hug between two friends is perfectly appropriate, but it also can be very awkward. It can be very uncomfortable, right? And so these are the things we need to talk about with our youngest kids, is about what's appropriate and what's not, even with those things, right? The other story that I've heard a lot comes from kids who go to dances. And they go to dances for the first time and they see kids dancing in ways that they feel uncomfortable even watching, let alone participating in, but they feel pressured. This is what's normal. This is what you're supposed to do. So I'm not kidding. With our middle school kids and with our high school kids, I am going to talk about how you appropriately slow dance, okay? And let me explain why. Because we need to help our kids understand that the way you interact with somebody who's a friend, the way you treat somebody who's just a friend of yours at a dance, who you're slow dancing with, that you have to treat a person who you're romantically involved with in the same exact way, all right? But we need to say more, not less. What I've heard a lot from kids, particularly our college students, is they say, you know, Brian, what you taught me about sex worked, but it wasn't enough. Because basically what we've taught kids is don't have sex until you're married. Now that's a very good lesson and one that I intend to reinforce, okay? Don't get me wrong. Please don't get me wrong on that. I am still going to teach the classic traditional position that sex before marriage is wrong, okay? But that's not enough. It's not enough because in a culture which emphasizes hookup, which emphasizes very casual sexual interactions, we need to teach kids, again, this idea that relationships matter. If you look at the logo that I've put together for this series, it's two puzzle pieces. One says love and one says sex. And the idea is that when those two things match, when the relationship and the physical signs of affection match, you've got a healthy relationship, whether it's a friendship, whether it's a marriage, whether it's a dating relationship, whatever it is. When those two things match, you've got a healthy, life-giving relationship. But when those two don't match, whatever the context, you've got an unhealthy relationship between two people. So the whole idea is to give kids a framework to think through what's the relationship I'm in and then what's appropriate given this relationship. The question is, how do we figure that out? Because the problem is, if we're honest, the Bible says very little about dating. And the reason is that dating, as we understand it today, is almost nowhere to be found in Scripture. Okay, it didn't work like that. It was either an arranged marriage or basically a weird kind of courtship thing. It just wasn't dating as we practice it now. And the other trick is that the ages at which kids were getting married were very different. Girls were getting married at a very young age, mid-teen years, late teen years at the latest. Men were getting married in very late teen years, early 20s, all right? You got a whole different culture. So if you try and look at the Bible for dating guidelines, you're not going to find anything. So instead, what we're going to do is we're going to talk through Jesus' greatest two commandments, love God and love others. Because my theory, and Jesus says this too, by the way, I'm stealing it from him, get those right. Get love of God and get love of others right, and you get everything else right. All right? So if in the context of a relationship, dating relationship, for example, you understand what it means to love God and to love the other person more than you love yourself, you're going to get the physical signs of affection and the sexuality side right. So that's the theory. We're going to look at that. We're going to drive that home as kind of our main message, right? In every relationship, but in particular in dating relationships, as we're talking about now, you want to make sure that you're loving God and loving others and putting yourself third, okay? We're also going to look very carefully at the passages in Scripture that do deal with sex. As I said, there's a lot in the Old Testament, right? And while we can't apply those verses, perfectly word for word because the context is very different, the principles behind those verses still hold, okay? So for example, there's a lot of verses in the Old Testament that basically are about protecting the women, about making sure that the women in the Old Testament times were protected from people who would damage them, who would provide them harm, all right? That says a lot about how we should practice sexuality in our culture today. Paul has a lot to say about sex in the New Testament, all right? Again, big cultural gap there, very different world, but again, you take the principles of those verses and apply them to Jesus' loving God and loving others. I think what you end up with is you end up with a very healthy, robust way to think through relationships and sexuality in a way that just saying don't do this and this is okay, you just can't do, right? Because if you tell kids, well, just don't have sex, all right? The next question you get immediately is, Well, can I kiss someone? Can I kiss someone I'm dating with? What about making out? Well, can we lay on a couch together? You suddenly get into this world where you're trying to come up with rules and guidelines and boundaries. And while I think those are really important, we've got to give kids a framework to think through, how do I decide what my boundaries are? How do I decide what's okay? How do I decide all those kinds of tough questions, all right? The problem is that this area of life is a lot messier than any of us would like it to be. It's a lot more complicated than any of us would like it to be. And my goal over the next 6 weeks is to give kids a framework with which to think through relationships and sexuality, to give them a framework to think through simple things, right? Slow dancing at dances, prom, that kind of stuff, right? That can get very awkward and difficult, to dating relationships, to all the way up to marriage, making decisions about what is appropriate, what's acceptable, what's healthy, all right? There's a whole lot, far short of sex, of intercourse, that's just not healthy for kids to be engaging in, and they need to understand that. But if you just say, don't have sex, they can say, well, I didn't have sex. It wasn't wrong. So I hope you see that we're not trying to get rid of the way we used to think about it. We're trying to give it a more robust foundation. We're trying to give it a healthier way to approach it, all right? Because the thing is, the two dominant ways of looking at sex, I think, fall short. The traditional Christian paradigm basically said this: don't have sex until you're married. And then once you're married, it's fine, all right? What we found out, though, is that approach falls short because it doesn't, one, give kids a framework to think things through before marriage, but number two, it casts sex as a bad thing. It casts sex as an unhealthy thing, as something that's wrong. And it's very hard to deprogram yourself as you age and get into marriage. The other paradigm that doesn't work at all is that of the secular paradigm, which basically says, look, sex between whatever combination of people is fine as long as there's consent. As long as everyone says it's okay, then it's okay. Both of these paradigms, I think, fall short. One just isn't robust enough to account for the complexities of life, and the other one doesn't account for the ethics and the relational context that's so important. Because we, as God's children, made in the image of God, are both physical creatures and emotional creatures and spiritual creatures. And the idea is that you've got to provide a balance in relationships between all three of those areas. And that's the goal of what we're going to do. One thing I should say is that the middle school and high school scopes will be very different. The topics will be the same. The middle school will be very, very different, though, topic-wise, than the high school. High school will be a lot more in-depth. We've got high school kids. They know a lot more. They're ready to hear a lot more. They need to hear a lot more. Middle school, we've got a big range between your 6th graders and your 8th graders, and believe me, I'm aware of that. I'm going to be very, very sensitive to that in the detail in which we go, the way the conversations go. So do know, if your high school kid comes home and says, we talked about this, and you go, oh gosh, I hope you didn't talk about that with middle school kids, chances are we talked about something similar, but not nearly as in detail. We want to be very sensitive to kind of where kids are developmentally over the next couple weeks. So this week I'm going to kick it off, and I'm going to kind of lay out what's out there and introduce them to the framework. And this week the most important thing I'm going to do is I'm going to make the case that the sources that they are learning about sex from, most of them, unless they're coming from you as parents, unless they're coming from trusted other adults, unless they're coming from their teachers at school who are providing them good, solid information, most of those sources are fake. That they're learning from entertainment what sex is supposed to be, not from healthy, good sources. So that's going to be the crux this week. Next week, I'll begin to talk through the paradigm of loving God, loving others, and what that means for relationships and sexuality. So each week, I will recap it, whether I do it via video or whether I send an email. Really want to emphasize communication with you so that you know what's covered. I'm going to do my level best to remember my voice recorder so that you can listen to my talk. You won't get to hear the group conversation afterwards, but you'll get to hear exactly what I said so that you can stay clued in, so that you know what's going on. The thing I want to underscore the most, I can say anything I want. These conversations are most important to have with your own kids. They are awkward, they're painful. You may not want to talk about it with them. They may not want you to talk about it with them, but the kids I know whose parents were open and honest and had real conversations with them, those are the kids that have the healthiest attitudes about relationships and sexuality. So I'm going to do everything I can to let you know what I covered and what's going on and what we're going to be covering, in hopes that you're able to do the same at home. So hope to see everybody on Sunday night as we kick off Real Sex Matters.